Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we kindly request all of you to please take your seats as we will commence the event shortly. We would also like to inform you that food and drinks are not allowed in the auditorium, as you can enjoy the snacks and drinks provided outside of this room. We would also like to inform you that in case of emergency, please find your way next to the exit door, which is in front of this auditorium, and the emergency stairs are located next to the elevator. Thank you, and we will be getting shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome to the CSIS Auditorium here in Jakarta. Welcome to the 2024 Hadi Soesastro Policy Forum, Indonesia and Australia in the Global Response to Climate Change, held by CSIS Indonesia in collaboration with Australian National University Indonesia Project. On this honorable occasion, I, Nadia Daulay, will be the host for this event. The Hadi Soesastro Policy Forum 2024, the first one after the COVID-19 pandemic, will feature Professor Ross Garnaut's lecture, which will take on the topic of global response to climate change and the potential for Indonesia-Australia cooperation in facing the challenge of climate change. Professor Ross Garnaut is Professor Emeritus in Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne and the Australian National University. Professor Garnaut's lecture will be discussed by Professor Mari Pangestu, member of CSIS Board of Trustees, and Dr. Masyita Crystallin, Senior Advisor to the Minister of Finance, Republic of Indonesia. Moderating today's session is Dr. Djisman Simandjuntak, Chair of the Board of Directors, CSIS Foundation. We hope that today's event can embody Pak Hadi's intellectual spirit and passion for knowledge. To begin this event, I would like to invite Dr. Yose Rizal Damuri, Executive Director of CSIS, to the stage to deliver his opening remarks. Dr. Damuri, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests. Very good morning to you all. I think we have a good weather today, so that's why I think contributes to the good turnout that we have this morning. And on behalf of CSIS, as the host of this event, let me first extend a warm welcome to all of you to our annual event of Hadi Soesastro Policy Forum. Yeah, I'm sorry that I cannot address each of you one by one. There are too many important persons here, important individuals. But I have an obligation to acknowledge the presence of some persons. They are very crucial for this event. And first, of course, I would like to greet Professor Ross Garnaut, to welcome Professor Ross Garnaut, who already flew all the way from Australia. Ross is a long-time friend of CSIS and also Pak Hadi Soesastro. I think you know us already for like, I don't know, maybe older than me, than myself. This morning, Ross would deliver his speech on climate issues and how the cooperations between Indonesia and Australia is elemental to win our fight against the climate change in both countries and perhaps also regionally or even globally, because we are such important countries, such important contributors to this initiative. Also, I would like to greet our friends, Ibu Dr. Masyita Crystallin from the Ministry of Finance, who is also very active in our discussions about climate. Bu Masyita, I think 2 weeks ago, also attended our event here as a speaker. So we're really glad that you can come also as a discussion for this forum. I also need, of course, to acknowledge the support of our own Ibu Professor Mari Pangestu, yeah, who also very eager in participating in joining our forum today. And to our chair of board of CSIS, Bapak Professor Djisman Simandjuntak, would moderate the discussions in this morning sessions. Thank you very much all for your presence and also for all the audience again for your presence in this forum. This Hadi Soesastro Policy Forum is actually the first after COVID, after four years of hiatus. But actually we started this Hadi Policy Forum in May, on May 30th, 2013. So it is already more than 10 years that we have this annual events. This is a collaborative annual forum held by CSIS and the Australian National University in honor to Pak Hadi, actually. And we really thank our colleagues at the ANU Indonesia project, particularly Mas Budi, Professor Budi Rekso Sudarmo, who actually support us and also support us to have this kind of forum and restart this forum again. So we will bring this forum back again as one of the annual CSIS events. So next year we will have another Hadi Soesastro Policy Forum again. This is very important one because for us, Pak Hadi Soesastro, or often we refer to him as Pak Minky, was not only our founder, was not only our director, but also a mentor, a teacher, and perhaps for many of us at CSIS and also outside CSIS, he's regarded to be the intellectual father for many of us. Pak Hadi was always known to be a brilliant, knowledgeable, insightful, hardworking, but also humble scholar. He could explain difficult things seems to be easy without making the listeners feeling threatened or feeling humiliated. In the words of one of my colleagues, Pak Hadi was always able to make even the most brainless of his opponent feel intelligent, actually. Yeah. That's the words of my colleague Mas Haryo. I don't know whether Mas Haryo is here or not, but that's true, and we always feel that way when we talk to Pak Hadi. Yeah. Pak Hadi is also a person with a very wide interest, actually. I met Pak Hadi for the first times when I took his class Technology and Innovations in Economic Developments at that time in early 1990s at the University of Indonesia, Universitas Indonesia. This is not an easy subject because in the early 1990s, normally technology was in economics was represented by coefficients, normally regarded as A. The shift to the production production function, yeah, that changed the productions with the same amounts of resources, and normally technologies was treated like a black box. Nowadays we know that the technology is very important in economy, and economics already look at it from various perspectives. But in the past, it was regarded like a black box, and nobody really knows what happens with the technology and economic developments. But in that class, actually, Pak Hadi gave us a lot of illustrations about the role of technology in economic activities and economic developments beyond just formal mathematical treatment. He opened that black box of technology rules in economics and examined the contents in very interesting ways about it. And that's why, that's what make me, for example, so really interested to become a policy analyst and joining CSIS as well in the end. And climate change and study and policy might not be Pak Hadi areas. Although, if you look at this book, the Hadi Soesastro, it's a collection of his writing during 50 years of his, perhaps 40 or 50 years of his scholarly period. You can see that many of his writings actually also talk about various factors or various issues related to the climate change and environment. Like, for example, Pak Hadi wrote a lot about energy transition to the renewable energy, also more specifically on how energy subsidy should be removed or should be reduced from our energy consumptions. And Pak Hadi always behind the curve, always ahead of the curve. He always have a very forward-looking on looking at, on examining so many various issues. It is very entertaining also because of this forum, I try to look at it again. I try to look at the book again and then read some of Pak Hadi's writing, and many of them are still relevant for our our challenge and our problem today. That's why actually we still miss him, even after 14 years of his passing. Well, I believe you will learn a lot about the about initiative related to climate change from Australia and Indonesia that Professor Ross Garnaut would present today. You will also learn a lot from the discussions, and I really hope that we can advance our cooperations between Indonesia and Australia, in particular to respond appropriately and effectively to the climate change. Since this is one of the most crucial issues that we face today. So I wish you all fruitful discussions today, and hopefully we all have something to contribute in fighting in our efforts to fight the climate change. Thank you very much. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Dr. Damuri, for your opening remarks. To start the discussion, I would now like to invite Professor Djisman Simandjuntak, Chair of the Board of Directors, CSIS Foundation, to the stage. Professor Simandjuntak, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadia. I am, I think, 2 years junior of Hadi Soesastro. When he studied at the RAND Corporation, Santa Monica, I was doing mine at the University of Cologne in Germany. And he came back earlier than I am. And we traveled to unlikely places on this small earth to carry perspectives of Indonesians on so many issues that are of concern for humanity, and to carry home back perspectives from other scholars and try to disseminate them to fellow Indonesians. And this lecture, this forum, is meant to carry forward Hadi Soesastro's contribution in many fields, not just in international trade and economy, but also in other areas. Carry forward to future works of CSIS. We may be different in our approach to things. I mean the newer generations, but I think some of the core values need to be carried forward while doing our works in the future. So we will continue this program, and for this year, who else can do it better than Professor Ross Garnaut, who was a close friend of Hadi Soesastro, a very close friend of CSIS too, and Indonesia at large. And this is particularly important in our time when geopolitics is coming back to our ways of looking at things. Professor Ross Garnaut is a great economist whose career is built around the analysis and practice and policy connected to economic development, international relations in Australia, Asia, and the Pacific. I think together with Hadi Soesastro and, of course, Mari Pangestu as well, they all belong to this Asia-Pacific mafia. And I think they leave a number of very important footprints for us to continue to study in years to come. Professor Ross Garnaut's latest fields of study includes climate change, one of the truly mind-boggling issues facing humanities nowadays. He produced the Garnaut Climate Change Review. It is in the internet, you can access it. Don't buy the expensive version. There are many versions of this book in the internet. He has also served in the government of Australia. It's a good combination with intellectual pursuit. He was ambassador to China in the years of 1985 to 1988. I think that was a period when China starting to enjoy the dividends of the reform of 1978. And he was also advisor to PM Bob Hawke. And in those days, I remember our relations between Indonesia and Australia was more than warm. And I think Professor Ross Garnaut has contributed a lot to that. He has also served in a number of corporate boards. It's interesting, serving government and the corporate world. I think this service in corporate boards has contributed to his passion and understanding of climate-related issues and how important it is that we adapt to the climate changes. His lecture today is titled Indonesia and Australia in the Global Response to Climate Change. And Indonesia has written a lot of commitments, but we are yet to deliver that commitment. And I think Australia has done a lot, but we share one thing in common, and that is we are both big emitters in the global economy. Without further ado, let me please join me to welcome Professor Ross Garnaut to give his lecture, and the panelists will be invited later after the lecture. Please, Professor Ross Garnaut.
Thank you, Dr Djisman, and thank you for the earlier introduction. It's wonderful to be back in Jakarta, back in Indonesia, back at CSIS. After for Jane and me, a hiatus during the COVID times, a hiatus also for the Hadi Soesastro Forum. And wonderful to be back, and back with old friends, and especially wonderful to see again Hadi's son, Agus, who's with us today. Jane and I last saw Hadi not long before his death, when he was undergoing medical treatment in Melbourne. He came round to our house and we had wonderful discussions, and that followed several decades of close interaction in which I certainly learned a lot about the possibilities of humanity, of cooperation and trust between people of different cultural backgrounds, and very, very different circumstances. So it's my very great honor to be here today at this forum in which we remember my longtime friend, and such an important contributor to this institution and the region. Now, I might need some technical assistance in making these things move. I'm going to talk about the very large challenge and the very large opportunity of the transition to deal with the problem of climate change. And I thought I'd remind us that this is a change, this energy transition, that we're always going to have to make because the high quality, easily accessible fossil carbon resources, coal, oil and gas, are limited, and they were going to become more and more scarce and expensive, and this was going to be a brake on modern economic development unless we found alternatives. And people have been thinking of those alternatives for a long time, and I came across this quote from Thomas Edison, the founder of General Electric, in conversation with Henry Ford, the first mass maker of cars, which have had so many carbon emissions in the 100 years since, and Harvey Firestone, who invented the modern tire to allow cars to do their job. And Edison said, "I put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that." Well, in the 21st century, we were reminded of the challenge of finite fossil carbon resources when China, the world's most populous country, grew faster than any country had ever grown before over a long period. For a long time, its period of very high investment-led growth from 2002 to 2012 led to huge growth in demand for oil and gas and coal. China became by far the world's biggest user of all of these things and imported all of these things from all over the world, and the price rose by 400%. And that was a reminder that we had to make some adjustment away from coal and oil and gas if we were ever going to reach what people who are interested in development, like Hadi, have always seen as the end point of development. All of the people of the world enjoying high material living standards as a basis for a good life. Well, you need an awful lot of energy for that, and much more energy than the world uses now. And sooner or later, we had to make an adjustment to other forms of energy other than coal. The crisis of climate, of which the world became aware about 3 decades ago, it gives us a more urgent reason for the transition that we would have had to make anyway. Professor Hadi Soesastro, a dear friend of mine over several decades, and we all recall his brilliant and subtle mind, his sympathetic understanding of the complexity of humans, his applications to the economic and political development of Indonesia, of this subtle thought through critical decades. No time more important than that painful transition from the military government to democracy through the huge financial crisis of the late 1990s. And I remember spending a lot of time with our Indonesian economist friends during that time, and others at the ANU, Professor Hal Hill, Chris Manning and others, and Stephen Grenville, Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, and interacting very closely with our Indonesian economist friends and colleagues, Hadi at at CSIS, Professor Bastri Dede, who had studied at ANU and was back playing major roles in Indonesia, and the complexity of that situation involving deep economic crisis, a fall in economic output as great as the fall in Germany during the Great Depression, that precipitated a huge collapse of confidence in government, and then the transition to what became a democratic Indonesia, but it could have been a transition in many directions. And I think that the thoughtful contributions to that of Hadi and colleagues here at CSIS, at UI, and elsewhere was crucial to what we can only see now as a marvelous outcome. Thinking back to the awful possibilities of the late 1990s, what we see now in Indonesia is wonderful. I think Hadi's biggest contribution might have been in helping Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries reconcile what had been inward-looking tendencies with taking advantage of all the opportunities of an open economy, of open international trade and investment. Hadi played a major role in the development of this institution, first executive director, and very influential here until his death, shaping the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, which grew out of a seminar at ANU in the late 90s, in which our colleagues at CSIS played a major role. And I think in the ideas that formed the PEC and later APEC, those sharing of ideas between Indonesians and Australians was of fundamental importance. I think that shaped the culture of APEC in ways that allowed what was not obviously possible at the beginning, and that was full participation of Southeast Asia in Asia-Pacific economic cooperation. And all of the time, this focus on regional cooperation was outward-looking and embedded in global structures, the World Trade Organization and its predecessor, the GATT, and understanding of these possibilities was built through close networks of scholars, economists, but also government officials, business people, through Indonesia, Australia, Southeast Asia, and the Asia Pacific. And Hadi was central to all of that. Thinking of his intellectual contributions, I think three stand out in my mind as being decisive in the way our region has developed in recent decades, or the last 40 years. Hadi kept reminding us all that you would not have productive international trade and investment if we lost sight of the central importance of development, that development cooperation had to be there at the center of thinking about trade and investment, that you would not get, for example, Indonesian and Southeast Asian participation in trade liberalization in Asia and the Pacific unless all of its partners were mindful of the imperative of development, of rising living standards in the developing countries of the region. Hadi used to talk about Asia-Pacific economic cooperation being a three-legged stool. A stool will not stand up if it's only got two legs, and development cooperation was one of the legs. And I remember many seminars where he put a picture of this stool on a slide. He was very important to the development of the idea of open regionalism, of developing closer cooperation within countries in a region without any discrimination against outsiders. Now, that's a different sort of idea. It's not the idea that's embodied in the conventional free trade agreement, where you have free trade between partners and discriminate against everyone else and try to take trade from other trading relations into that. The idea was to have closer economic cooperation, expansion of trade and investment without discrimination against outsiders. And in this world of open regionalism, deeper integration between partners happened not through formal legal arrangements that had the effect of excluding others, like conventional free trade agreements, but the closer knowledge, the closer understanding would allow much higher levels of trade and investment and bigger gains from trade. And so you'd get those benefits without damaging trade relations with other countries. Very different from the preferential trade agreements which became dominant after the East Asian financial crisis and in the 21st century, and through which we've had very little trade expansion after that period of rapid trade expansion under open regionalism in the 1980s and especially the 1990s. Today in 2024, we face a crisis in global development, and it has several elements. We have to understand the failure so far to deal with the climate change issue as a threat to global development. If we do not deal with the problem of climate change, we can expect disruption on a scale that undermines economic development throughout the world. We've also got a threat of geostrategic competition, not only, but most importantly, the conflict between the US and China, which has broken down a lot of the open approach to international economic relations that was so important to economic development in the several decades until about a decade ago. And that's closely associated with a rise in protectionism in the developed countries, which threatens to undermine the trade expansion, which has been so important to development and incomes growth through Asia in particular over the last several decades. Together, these developments are contributing to fragmentation of international trade and development. Now, some of that seems now to be inevitable, but we have to do our best to get substantial gains from international cooperation, international trade, and international investment in a world in which there is a reality of substantial fragmentation of trade and development. It's a harder world. We have to think better about mechanisms that can allow trade expansion and economic development to succeed despite these fragmenting development. That's the fragmentation of global trade over the last decade has been associated with a slowing of global trade growth and economic growth, and especially, as always, damage to economic development in the developing world. Fortunately, Indonesia has continued to do reasonably well over the past decade, back to 5% growth now after the COVID crisis. Through the 21st century so far, average growth over 5%. And the immediate prospects from what my friends have been telling me since we arrived a couple of days ago are reasonably good. But continuation of that reasonably good performance is going to depend on maintaining open trade and investment with the rest of the world at a time when that's harder than it used to be. And slower economic growth makes it more difficult to maintain the investment, the policy focus that's necessary for success on climate change. So all of the challenges to economic development that we've got in the modern world reinforce each other, increase the degree of difficulty, and increase the importance of careful, wise thinking about the nature of the challenges we face. And in that thinking, I'm continuing to reflect upon the relevance of ideas that Hadi introduced into the discussion of ASEAN development and Asia-Pacific economic cooperation in an era that was in some ways less challenging than today. The ideas therefore become even more important in today's circumstances. Those ideas include, when we think of trade and investment and all the benefits to developed countries as well as developing that come with that, we can't lose focus on the central importance of making the expansion of international trade and investment relevant to development. We'll lose the participation of developing countries in many of the gains, and we'll certainly lose the opportunity to deal with climate change unless we keep our mind focused on the importance of development of rising incomes in the developing world. I think the idea of concerted unilateral liberalization within, which was part of the idea of open regionalism that Hadi helped to develop, is very relevant to climate change. The idea of open regionalism with concerted unilateral liberalization was that countries would not sit down and formally make concessions to each other around a bargaining table like they do with a free trade agreement or even in a round of GATT negotiations, but they'd agree on an objective of eventually free and open trade, which was agreed by the APEC countries at that meeting of APEC heads of government in Bogor, just up the road from here, in 1994, a session in which CSIS played a major role in development of ideas and in the thinking of President Suharto at the time. Hadi, Yusuf Wanandi, Murray and others here contributing a great deal to that. And the idea was that all the countries that were members of APEC would agree that we would have free and open trade at a distant date. Well, that was 1994. It was to be 2010 for the developed countries and 2020 for the developing countries. And with that objective in mind, each country would go about its own liberalization, not having agreed a tit-for-tat set of exchanges in advance, but would go on with its own liberalization, guided by the shared goal. What was concerted was the ultimate goal, but each country unilaterally would make its decisions. We made very big progress in the first decade of APEC on that. In 1989, the beginning of APEC, several of the ASEAN countries had very high protection, including Indonesia, the Philippines, probably Indonesia and the Philippines in particular. And then in the years in which each of them hosted the APEC heads of government meetings, President Suharto in Bogor in 1994, President Ramos in Manila a couple of years later, that was the occasion of announcing major unilateral initiatives. That was also the time of the opening up of China, reduction of trade barriers, which created vast new opportunities for exports from Indonesia and Australia probably two of the very biggest beneficiaries from that. You had liberalization of agricultural imports in Korea and Japan, which a decade before it seemed to be the very hardest nuts of protection in international trade. And New Zealand and Australia underwent trade liberalization during that period that saw them become move from being about the most protected developed countries, at least in relation to manufactured goods, not in agriculture, but in manufactured goods, to amongst the most open of economies. So that open regionalism was very successful. It was a new approach. It wasn't the approach of the rest of the world. It was later made more difficult by developments in the 21st century. Well, initially, the world attempts to deal with climate change through international cooperation were based on a model that looked like the old tit-for-tat trade negotiation model, where any reduction in emissions was seen as a concession to other countries. And so countries would sit around and bargain and try to give away as little as possible. And the negotiators felt very good if they gave away nothing and other countries gave away a lot. It was like the old trade negotiations. And it didn't work, just like the old tit-for-tat trade negotiations didn't work. That top-down framework of negotiated arrangements was shaped at Kyoto in 1997, and there was actually not much progress on the Kyoto Agreement. It was a very important agreement in the history of dealing with climate change because it agreed on a number of rules about how we would measure greenhouse gas emissions, how we would compare carbon dioxide with oxides of nitrogen, with oxides of with other greenhouse gas emissions, with methane. So it was very important to have that framework, but there actually wasn't very much progress under that. The real progress, I think, really began in the failure of the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009. In an attempt to, we had a very important meeting in Bali in 2007. I was there with Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd at the time, working on my climate change review, a very important Indonesian leadership of the international discussion at that time. Important for us because Australia rejoined the Kyoto Convention because our government had taken us right outside the Kyoto Convention once President George Bush took the United States outside. Then our Prime Minister decided to follow the United States and step aside from the international effort. That was a terrible time. That ended at Bali in 2007. Bali talked about ideas that could be brought to fruition at Copenhagen at the end of 2009. But that was really the end point of failing to make progress under the old model at Copenhagen. Everyone went with their ideas of tit-for-tat negotiations, and it fell apart. It was an unsuccessful meeting, a very sad occasion. But President Obama of the United States at the time was, I think, a highly intelligent leader, very committed to the climate change objective. He was loath to just be part of a complete failure, and so at the last minute there were some discussions, a subgroup of big developing countries and President Obama. China was there, South Africa, Brazil, and India, I think, at a late night meeting. And they came up with a bit of a statement that seemed at the time to be a face-saving statement at the end of a failure, but it really laid the basis of some ideas that at the Copenhagen meeting of the United Nations 2 years, it was Cancun the next year, and then yes, at Cancun the next year, 2010, were given more formal expression. And then at Cancun, it was accepted that the way forward was to be concerted unilateral mitigation, which was really taken from the APEC idea on trade liberalization. It was that new basis that countries went about thinking about an ultimate objective, a concerted objective, to which they would each make unilateral contributions and then revise those periodically over time until they added up to a solution to the climate problem. That approach was finally locked in at Paris in 2015, a very important agreement when the whole world, developing countries and developed countries, agreed on the objective of holding temperature increases caused by humans below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees, and agreed on the general approach. And we saw that general approach starting to work at Glasgow in 2021 under the unlikely leadership of Boris Johnson. At the Glasgow meeting, the objective was confirmed of holding temperature increases as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. The advice from the atmospheric physics was accepted that that would require net zero emissions by 2050. At that meeting, a number of countries that hadn't made commitments to net zero before made those commitments. So it was of historic importance. It brought the whole world into the approach to a concerted unilateral mitigation. It was at that meeting that Australia, for the first time, joined all of the other developed countries which had already done it to net zero by 2050. It was at that meeting that Indonesia committed to net zero by 2060. China committed to net zero by 2060. India to net zero by 2070. Russia with Indonesia and China joined 2060. Now the arithmetic is a little bit awkward. You only get to net zero for the world as a whole by 2050 if all countries are net zero by 2050, but also ever since Kyoto, the international community had wisely accepted that developed countries had to get to net zero first, that they had more resources for making the adjustment, that they had contributed more to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that were already causing problems, and so developed countries should move first. And so in the book that I edited with colleagues at the new Australian Superpower Institute a couple of years ago, there's a chapter by an Australian atmospheric physicist that says we can meet that 2050 goal if all countries bring their net zero timetable forward by 5 years. That means developed countries, including Australia, 2045, Indonesia, China, Russia, 2055, India, and other poorer countries. And we do have to accept that India and many African countries are poorer than Indonesia and China by 2065. But for the moment, the targets that are on the table are a very big step forward. And countries made those commitments in the middle of COVID in Glasgow with serious intent. And that embodies an idea of concerted unilateral mitigation that really came out of the Asia-Pacific discussions on concerted unilateral liberalization and open regionalism, many of which were developed in contributions in discussions in which Hadi Soesastro played a major role. With concerted unilateral mitigation, it's concerted because participating countries agree on a strong objective. In APEC, it was free and open trade by 2010 or 2020. It's the net zero commitments for climate change. It's unilateral because each country designs its own way of getting there in the light of its understanding of, above all, its own circumstances. But countries aren't left entirely to themselves. Every 5 years, there's a meeting of the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change to assess how we're going and to for every country to strengthen its commitments and take note of what other countries are doing with a view to upgrading the effort so that over time we move towards the ultimate objective. In current circumstances where we're not doing enough, we'll only make progress if some countries each time are recognizing the advantages of accelerating progress. We have made progress since Paris. We're moving in the right direction. We can now expect the worst of the climate change outcomes to be better than looked possible or even likely a decade ago. That's progress, but it's not enough progress. Unless we accelerate progress in all countries, then we're not going to achieve anything like the objective. We've got to accelerate progress at a time when it's becoming more difficult. It's going to be much better for all of our economies if we move towards net zero by each contributing products according to our comparative advantage. Open trade is going to be really important in this transition. It's really important for economic development. We've learned that from the experience of the last half century, but it's going to be really important in allowing economic development to continue while dealing with economic change. The different countries contribute to international trade in zero carbon goods according to their comparative advantage. And that's more difficult in a world of increasing protection and geostrategic tension. But we've got to achieve the outcome or we'll fail on climate change. Just a few points on the failing climate change effort. Despite the strengthening of commitments, the fact that we're making some progress, we have to acknowledge that the national commitments do not yet add up to a solution, the commitments we've made. But even more challenging, we have to acknowledge that national commitments are not yet being made. And there's also a challenge that we may have to deal with, that we may end up with the President of the United States, elected in November, who thinks that atmospheric physics is a lot of rubbish. That will make things harder. We may have to go through a few years in which to keep alive the possibility of climate change. The rest of the world will just have to carry things despite America not contributing. The US is contributing through its domestic decarbonization under the Biden administration. In fact, very strongly. It's doing it in ways which are not great for global development, highly protectionist, huge budget deficits that are raising world interest rates and making development harder all over the world. But it is decarbonizing America. We may lose that in November. And if we do lose it in the United States, let's us in the rest of the world maintain momentum so that those many Americans, I'm pretty sure a majority of Americans who actually want to deal with the climate problems can easily rejoin the global effort after hopefully a short hiatus. I note here that there is one region of the world that has been doing very well over the past decade, and that's Europe, especially the European Union, and of which Britain was a member until recently, but even the UK. The current Prime Minister has taken a step back on climate commitments, but he won't be there very long. And from July the 4th, the likely new Prime Minister of Britain is committed to deepening the substantial contributions that the UK has already made, and other parts of Europe that are not in the European Union, the Scandinavian countries, are making very big contributions. So there is one part of the world where a lot of progress is being made. We should acknowledge that, and linking to that can be helpful to all of the rest of us. If we fail, let's be quite clear, the effects on development and the effects on the international political order will be catastrophic. Australia and Indonesia share immense interest in the success of global mitigation. In my climate change review that Professor Djisman referred to at the beginning, I did the calculations that showed that if we failed to deal with climate change, that all of the world would be severely damaged, but Australia would be the most damaged of developed countries. And that's because we're already a hot country where a lot of activities are already at the margins of what humans can manage. So if you get changes from that situation, it's particularly damaging. Also because Australia is the only developed country that lives mainly in a region of developing countries. And our trade, more than any other developed country, is mainly with developing countries. And a failure of climate change mitigation would be, we've all understood, to be especially severe and destabilizing in developing countries. And Australia is in a world of developing countries. Our closest neighbour to the north, Papua New Guinea, highly vulnerable to climate change, 1 million people living within a metre or two of sea level, and walking distance from the closest Australian islands at low tide in the days before climate change. And Australians are not as aware as we should be of the challenge to stability in Papua New Guinea and Australia's huge interest in the development success of Papua New Guinea for that region, the development success that will be undermined by unmitigated climate change. Right through Southeast Asia, South Asia, and coastal China, a very large part of the modern economy, very large populations. Most of the big cities are very close to sea level, many built on river deltas or the edge of rivers, and the combination of rising sea levels and more intense climatic events will be very damaging to life in those coastal cities. In Indonesia, there's a lot of awareness now amongst citizens of the vulnerability of cities like Jakarta and Semarang and Surabaya. But such is true of many of the capitals and great cities of the Asian region, Bangkok, Manila, Mumbai, Dhaka, much of Bangladesh, and so Australia is damaged not only by what climate change would do in Australia, but by instability and failure of development in its own region. And Indonesia too, very vulnerable itself, but also will be affected by damage and failure of development in neighbouring countries. Now, our two countries are quite a big part of the world problem. Australians like to think, well, we're only 1.25% of global emissions, so what we do doesn't matter very much. But if you add coal and natural gas together, we're the biggest exporter of those two products together. And Australia and Indonesia are the world's biggest exporters of thermal coal, huge exporters of coal. And that increases emissions in our own country as we open up the coal mines, but more importantly, generates huge emissions elsewhere. Both Australia and Indonesia are big emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. As Europe's come down, Indonesia's risen. So add the forestry emissions and the carbon combustion emissions and everything together, and Indonesian emissions per head are higher than the EU, despite the much higher standards of living in Europe. And Australian per capita emissions are at the highest in the world. My colleagues in the introductory remarks were kind enough to say that Australia's made good progress. We made good progress on one thing. We've greatly expanded the role of renewable energy and reduced the role of coal and gas, but in many other areas we haven't. Industry has had rising emissions. Fugitive carbon dioxide emissions from opening up natural gas and coal mines have continued to increase and might increase in future unless we change our strategy. So our story is not a great one. The opportunity for Australia of being a leading player in acceleration of the global effort to zero emissions is very great. In a zero carbon world, Australia's extraordinary resources of renewable energy and also its considerable opportunities to grow biomass sustainably as an input into zero carbon industry will support the development of major new export industries, and that can contribute a great deal to Australian development. In my book, The Superpower Transformation, the one that came out in 22, I say that Australia could directly contribute to reduction of global emissions by 8 to 9% if it used to the full its opportunity to provide zero carbon goods using renewable energy to the rest of the world. And Indonesia has a different set of challenges and opportunities. In Indonesia, as in Australia, to use these opportunities will require different approaches to policy and different approaches to using opportunity. In Indonesia as a whole, there are a variety of good renewable energy resources, but a lot of them tend to be in the outer islands, and the wonderful hydroelectric potential, including pumped hydro and conventional hydro in Kalimantan, in Papua, in parts of Sumatra and Sulawesi. That potential is of very great value in stabilizing systems with renewable energy, but you can't bring all of that to account without new approaches to electricity transmission and the grid. And Indonesia has a very big opportunity in the climate and soil that allows very productive growth of biomass. You have to do this sustainably, and it can be done sustainably, not by chopping down growth forests, but by using land that has already been used productively. That biomass is going to be essential in all of the industries that replace the oil, gas and coal in chemical manufacturers. It's going to be very scarce and valuable and the basis of a whole range of new export industries. But because we've got such big coal and gas industries, both Australia and Indonesia are challenged by the power politically of fossil carbon interests. It's a fact of political economy that's debilitating for good policy in both of our countries. Well, I mention here a few of the elements of Australia-Indonesia cooperation, and in discussion we can take that much further. I think the foundation for cooperation in this new world of zero carbon goods has to be keeping trade open to each other and our regional neighbours and the world, getting closer to each other, expanding trade with each other through greater trust, knowledge, understanding, but not artificially promoting bilateral trade by discriminating against outsiders. We've worked like that before. This is going to be necessary as the foundation for cooperation in the zero carbon world. I think there are opportunities for building on the old APEC economic cooperation. Now, not a lot has worked in APEC in the last decade since the global financial crisis, but one thing has. Two very distinguished graduates of the Australian National University, Professor Murray Pangestu and Dr. Craig Emerson. Murray was Trade Minister of Indonesia and Craig was Trade Minister of Australia at that crucial time after the global financial crisis, and to try to put some momentum into APEC cooperation and trade liberalisation, and to make a contribution at a time when not much else was happening to the climate change cooperation between countries. They led the APEC trade ministers and later heads of government into endorsing an agreement on maintaining open trade in goods that were important for the climate change effort, for environmental goods. And this agreement, it was voluntary, like everything in APEC, unilateral, countries had to commit, but 19 of the APEC members, nearly all, agreed to be part of it. And they all agreed to, within a period, I forget the exact period, a decade or so, they were going to reduce tariffs on a list of environmental goods, including goods for making renewable energy, but quite a lot of others, down to a maximum of 5%. There's a little bit of conflict between Indonesia and some others about whether palm oil was an environmental good. It was very much an environmental good because it could be the basis of zero carbon in manufacturing inputs. So that was a plus, but some damage to the forest kept other people worried. But eventually, I think that issue was sorted out in that APEC context. Of those 19 countries, I think that 16 have complied completely. A couple of Chile didn't quite, hasn't quite yet. It said it still will, but all the time it's been nearly compliant because Chile's been operating over this period in a world in which the maximum tariff was only 6%, only 1%. They said we'll get rid of the 1% on environmental goods sometime. It doesn't matter very much except symbolically, and they haven't done it yet. Malaysia and Thailand wanted a bit more time, but were making progress. The US was fully compliant until Donald Trump became president. And I've said enough about Donald Trump, although I think that's the first time I've mentioned his name. And I think there's another set of opportunities, and maybe Murray will be good enough to help my understanding on this, and that's through the regional, to the RECEP partnership of doing more in open regionalism in this region, expanding trade, especially in goods relevant to the zero carbon economy without discriminating against outsiders. And for all of this to work, it'll work much better if we've got a strong WTO, and we don't at the moment. So we can do a lot without it, so long as we maintain non-discriminatory approaches to alternative arrangements, but we'll do much better if we can work together to strengthen the WTO. Doesn't look great given the current contests in the United States, but the rest of us can make some contribution. Within this framework of open regionalism applied to the zero carbon world, I think there's a very big opportunity for a foundational trade opportunity to build cooperation and contribute to development in both of our countries by cooperating in ambitious infrastructure. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But that could be a way of at an earlier date and at lower cost, providing for Indonesian industry an abundance of zero emissions electricity, and that's going to be very important to realizing other Indonesian development goals. Under President Jokowi, Indonesia's made progress on that old ambition of processing more of the mineral resources. But one big constraint has been a shortage of energy. If you put up a new nickel processing plant or aluminium processing plant or copper processing plant in Java, it took scarce electricity away from other things, and it was a challenge. And so that's led to the development of new coal-based power stations to supply the nickel smelters or the other mineral processing. And in the zero, we've got to be mindful that the things we put in place now are going to be working in 10 or 20 years, and we've got to keep reducing emissions. We can't afford to use coal in that way. We've got to think of alternatives. And if we do continue to use coal in that way, then the nickel that's processed is a great achievement of Indonesia to have the nickel processed here. I know Indonesians have wanted that for a long time, but it will not be allowed into the high-price markets of the world. The European border adjustment mechanism will keep it out because it will be considered to be dirty nickel, and it's only by decarbonising that you'll get entry to the parts of the world that give very high prices for these products. And I think that Australia-Indonesia cooperation can lead to the improvement in competitiveness of a lot of both of us in exporting zero carbon goods to the rest of the world. This will go much further if Australia does what it's promised at the United Nations discussions on climate to do, and that is make a large contribution to development, to developing countries in their transition to zero carbon emissions. And I think it's appropriate, and I think this is the view of the Australian government, that this Australian effort should be devoted especially to countries that are our immediate neighbours in the Southwest Pacific, Papua New Guinea and the other South Pacific countries, Timor-Leste and Indonesia. In my discussions in Jakarta already, and I look forward to more over the next few days, I keep being reminded by my friends here of some quite large barriers to Indonesia making quick progress. And I'll just mention a couple of these because dealing with these problems could help a lot, both in Indonesian development, a better economy, and also dealing with the climate problem. One of these is the extraordinary subsidies that are still given for carbon transport fuels, petrol and diesel, and the extraordinary subsidies that are given to use of coal in power generation in Indonesia. The cap, the 35, the requirement that Indonesian coal exporters sell 35% of their coal at a very low price to domestic power generation. That's a subsidy to use of coal in power. And the huge budget subsidy to lower the price of petrol and diesel. These are very expensive for the budget. Indonesia's got a big budget challenge, needs to spend a lot more money on development and on services for low-income people. The new president is committed to that. You're going to need a much stronger budget. The carbon subsidies are weakening the budget by a large amount. So dealing with that deals with an economic development problem as well as a carbon problem. I think that there's a very strong case for Australia-Indonesia cooperation in carbon pricing. Now, this is an idea I haven't put forward before, but I'm increasingly aware of it. I'll say just as I'll just say a little bit about that now. All economists know that if you want to reconcile continued growth in the economy with reduction in carbon emissions, the efficient way to do that is to put a price on carbon, to tax carbon or to have a regulatory restriction on carbon with traded carbon permits, either of which generates a carbon price. Both can generate a lot of revenue for the government by selling permits if you have an emission trading scheme. In Australia, we did that. The Gillard government, on the basis of recommendations that I'd made in my 2 climate change reviews, did introduce carbon pricing, and it was working very well between 2012 and 2014. Emissions were coming down quite rapidly. If we'd continued at that rate of reduction, we would have got to where we had to get. And it was not disrupting the economy. The government got a lot of revenue, which it used for tax cuts and social security payments and fiscal support for the new renewable energy. It was working very well, but it became politically contentious, got caught up in what came to be known in Australia as the culture wars, and was abolished by Tony Abbott in 2014. And since then, it's sort of been accepted as politically too hard to have a carbon price in Australia. Well, my colleague in the Superpower Institute in Australia, Rod Sims, and I at the National Press Club a couple of months ago put carbon pricing back on the agenda in Australia, because I don't think we're going to get there without disruption of the economy. We're not going to get to our climate objectives without disruption of the economy, without a carbon price. If you don't have a carbon price, then you have a debate about every bit of production of gas or coal. You have a debate about whether nuclear energy or solar energy is the best form of energy going forward. If we keep having these debates about particular things and government subsidising some things and not others, we're going to have such uncertainty that we're not going to get the very high levels of investment that are going to be necessary to reconcile decarbonisation with growth in the economy and rising income. So Australia is making some progress, especially on renewable energy. It's starting to make some progress through a safeguard mechanism in reduction of emissions in industry, but it's too small. We're not going to get there without a carbon price. And I'd say the same for Indonesia. Now, I know a very big effort has been made in Indonesia to introduce a carbon price. So you're one step ahead of us now. We were a step ahead of you. We were a big step ahead of you in 2012 to 2014. But then we stepped back, and you've taken a small step. And that's good. I commend that. The price is very low. It's not actually going to affect behaviour very much. and the structure doesn't give very much government revenue. So the idea I'm throwing in for discussion now is that Australia and Indonesia, and if possible, our small neighbours nearby, Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea, should think about carbon pricing together, and maybe have a very simple form of carbon pricing to put a tax on carbon where it's produced or where it's imported. If you import oil from the Middle East, put a tax when it comes across the border. If you mine coal or gas, put a tax there. And in Australia, we would be taxing it at 105 sites for gas and coal, and maybe at 10 or so ports where we import petroleum products. It'd be very simple to administer. I suggest putting it on at the price of the European carbon price. Now, that's much higher. That's much higher than there's lots of giggles here because we all know that's impossible. But what I'm going to say, it's impossible, but not as impossible as the alternatives. The alternatives are much worse for the budget, much worse for economic development, much worse for climate change mitigation. So what we'll be doing is choosing amongst impossible things. And I think a proper carbon price for Australia and Indonesia, currently impossible in both, maybe for the next couple of years impossible in both, but I think it's much less impossible than anything else. Unfortunately, the most possible thing is failure and catastrophic disruption of our economies and the international political order. Why use the European carbon price? Well, I think we have to go towards a global carbon price, and the Europeans from 2026 are going to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It will gradually be phased in to 2030. Once it's completely phased in, it will tax products that are imported by the European estimate of the amount of carbon in those goods. And we tax them at the same rate as domestic production of those goods in Europe. For example, if there's a nickel smelter in Europe and they have to pay a price of 90 euros, 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide, then that increases the cost of nickel production in Europe. So if any Indonesian nickel goes to Europe, it will have to pay that tax. Well, if we've got a similar level of tax on carbon, then we can negotiate open access to European markets. And those European markets are going to be much higher price markets for all of these goods that contain carbon. Europe's a bigger market for Indonesia than Australia, so that's an even more important thing for Europe than for Australia. But it can be very important in getting the new zero carbon industries going. Then if we can manage to get zero carbon electricity into the processing of nickel and copper and aluminium and other products, then that will be a huge boost to the processing of these products in Indonesia. Australia and Indonesia, because we are the two biggest exporters of thermal coal, if we act together, it stops any distortion of trade. Well, one reaction when Rod Sims and I made that proposal at the National Press Club, we said we know that the government and the opposition will immediately reject it, and we were right. But we said we'll discuss it, and through discussion we'll increase understanding and change what is possible. And I hope that, say by 2030, and there'll be enough understanding to make this possible. But the strongest objection was, well, if we do that in Australia and Indonesia doesn't, then Indonesia will take our coal markets away. So we can't do that. So and I'm sure that if there was a suggestion that Indonesia has a higher carbon price, everyone would say, oh, Australia will just take over our coal market. Well, if we do it together, then that is not a question. And for LNG, Australia is a very big player in the LNG markets of Northeast Asia, well, of Asia, but especially Northeast Asia. So is Papua New Guinea, so is Timor-Leste, Indonesia, because it uses so much gas itself now, not so big, but we're quite big together in the LNG market. Our main competitors are the Middle East countries, and anyone who says we shouldn't put up taxes on gas in Australia because the Middle East will take our share doesn't take account of the fact that the Emirates and Saudi get about 80 or 90% of profits as taxation or profits from their state-owned companies. So we don't have to worry about them. They're taxing their producers much more highly than we're producing our own. So this could be an area of cooperation with Indonesia and Australia at the core, but good if we can engage with Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea as well. It could be transformational for the budget of all of these countries, give us a completely change our budgetary situations, and we all can do with a fair bit of that at a time of rising global interest rates because of increasing deficits in the budgets of some big developed countries. And finally, a little bit more on the transmission problem. Everyone I talk to who's serious about reducing emissions and the energy transition in Jakarta is very much aware of the very big problems of the grid. First, some small ones. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of difficulty in connecting to the grid new renewable energy capacity, including small-scale capacity from households and factory roofs. That needs to be dealt with, but I'm putting the main emphasis today on a bigger transformational thing, and that's the need for a national grid. Now, my friend and colleague Budi has done a lot of work on this, and will do more in future. And his work is demonstrating the advantages of an archipelago-wide high voltage direct current transmission grid going under the water between islands that can balance the renewable energy resources across the country. This is necessary as part of a wider grid reform in Indonesia. In my book, The Superpower Transformation, Appendix 1-2, for those who want to look it up, I've said there's a case for a continental-wide high-voltage direct current transmission grid in Australia, which would have one point in the northwest, in the Pilbara, not very far from Timor and Indonesia. Once we have such an Australian grid, which is necessary for Australian domestic decarbonisation and growth opportunities, an Indonesia-wide grid for Indonesian development purposes, it will be relatively straightforward to join them. Not quite straightforward. There is a tectonic plate where the Australian there's a point where the Australian tectonic plate bumps into the Asian tectonic plate, so we'll need real experts in plate tectonics to tell us where and how to do that. But by joining those two grids, the distance will not be very far, and we'll have a much bigger system. We could bring Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste into that, and each of those could contribute a great deal of zero carbon or low carbon economy. In the case of Papua New Guinea, extraordinary hydro resources from the huge mountains and the big falls on the southern coast. In Timor-Leste, there probably are some opportunities for efficient carbon capture and storage from gas power generation, at least for a period, and certainly the neighbouring islands are particularly suitable for solar energy. So development advantages in bringing our two smaller neighbours into the story. At the eastern end of the Indonesian grid, once you're in South Sumatra, you're just across the water from Singapore. And that introduces the opportunity of joining Indonesia and Australia to a continental power transmission system which would be very helpful for reducing costs and stabilizing access to renewable energy. So there's some reflections on the past, reflections on the great contributions in the past of our friend and colleague Hadi Soesastro, and some applications of ideas with which Hadi was associated to dealing with the very big challenges that we face in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ross Garnaut, for the very insightful lecture. You cover a very wide area, a very complex issues ranging from trade all the way to climate change. And the idea of open regionalism and concerted unilateralism, I think, are the way for us to go and to explore and put it into policies. Let me invite our two discussants. First, Ibu Mari Pangestu. She needs no introduction. And of course, Ibu Masyita Crystallin. Ibu Mari was the World Bank Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnership from March 2020 and 2023. And we are glad to have her back in Jakarta. Ibu Dr. Crystallin is Staf Khusus Menteri Keuangan for the formulation of fiscal and macroeconomic policy with special focus on climate change issues. And I think this is also very important. Without finance, nothing moves in life. Without further ado, let me invite Ibu Mari to present her comments, maybe up to 15 minutes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, thank you, Pak Djisman, for your kind introduction. Let me start my discussion comments with a few statements about our friend and mentor, Pak Hadi Soesastro, because today I feel very honored to be here sitting on a panel, actually with all ANU-related people. And just to say that I would not be here today if not for the person that we are honoring today, remembering today, Pak Hadi, and also the person who just delivered a very electrifying lecture, Professor Ross Garnaut. I'll explain in a little while why. Of course, Hadi Soesastro, I knew him as Om Minky to begin with, before he became my boss, my mentor, and then eventually colleague and friend. He was the most humble, caring, and brilliant human being. I think everybody has been saying that, who helped not only my professional journey, but he did actually arrange my wedding. And he was godfather to one of my sons. And he really was the beacon to help me learn so many things that helped me in my professional life. He basically threw me in the deep end with PECC when he asked me to, at that time, the Trade Policy Forum. That was in '91, right? And I had no idea what PEC was. But it was a really, really important learning experience and journey that actually helped me a lot when I became a trade minister. Because I was very fond of saying at that time, in APEC meetings, they were very familiar with me because I used to attend the APEC meetings as the PEC observer. And I would say, I may not look so old, but I have been with APEC from the beginning. And everybody was like, oh, what was that all about? And I used to always give a lot of time to the PEC observer sitting in the room. So I think it was the value of the learning that you mentioned, Ross. And I just also want to appreciate that we're honoring him and his memory today. And I just want to acknowledge the representative from the Soesastro family. Where are you? Agus, where are you? Somewhere there. Hi, Agus. You are as brilliant and creative as your father. I just wanted to emphasize that because we have all enjoyed wearing your creative creations. And of course, Ross, you wonder why you're important in my life journey. Of course, you always had time for me as a young student in ANU, but most importantly, you passed me for my master's thesis. You were my external examiner. I guess if you didn't pass me, I wouldn't be here today. So thank you, Ross, and thank you so much for coming here today to deliver the Hadi Soesastro lecture. And after such a hiatus, I think you really inspired everybody in the room, both with the historical perspective and bringing it to today's context. So let me now turn to my discussants' comments. I know I only have 15 minutes. I feel like I have a lot to say, but I hope I can get my big messages across. I really wanted to focus on 3 points. The concerted unilateral mitigation, and I would add adaptation in there. This is a bit difficult to see above the flowers, but it's okay. I have the hard copy here. Yes, okay, that's better. Okay, so I can see what I'm clicking. You're going to use this later, yeah. Yeah, so I think what you mentioned, how the parallel between what we did in the past in the Asia-Pacific context about unilateral, concerted unilateral liberalization. Now we're talking about unilateral mitigation, and also the opportunities. This is the shared vision for a just, inclusive development. Is really what I want to talk about in terms of the narrative. That's important, because you were saying we're not quite there yet. We've agreed to do it unilaterally, but we're not quite there yet. And I think the issue is about the narrative and helping countries to actually come up with country-led and country-owned platforms. And hopefully I'll have time to say something about the role of bilateral, sub-regional and regional cooperation, including Australia, Indonesia within that. So I think the first issue is about that the narrative about business as usual is costing us, the world and in individual countries. You made this point really a lot, because the climate crisis is going to lead you to lower growth and lower quality of life. And it is based on your review, it's based on the science, and it is really the trade-off between inaction now and action now. Okay? No longer about the trade-off between climate and development. I think we've shifted that debate, but this is just, if we want to, what we have to convince is the politicians and the policymakers. So this is this going to scare the policymakers enough or the politicians enough to action? I don't know, but you got to put numbers. This is my own experience as a policymakers. If you don't put numbers into the story, it doesn't resonate as much. So this comes from the World Bank Country Climate and Development Report on Indonesia. They use modeling and everything and this is just the summary of it. Your growth will decline, and by 1.2.4%. And it will get worse as if you don't address the climate crisis. And it is the poorest and the vulnerable that's going to be affected most. Health and quality of human capital. I actually think that the episode we had last year with the pollution in Jakarta being so bad was a very good wake-up call. And I think that's why it played into the elections as well. Pollution reduces life expectancy, productivity, etc., etc. Traffic congestion, frequency of natural disasters, and if you don't do anything, the transition risks are going to be very high. So this is in encapsulating the numbers that you could use to try to convince policymakers that this is the cost of inaction. But let's not just scare them, but the narrative should be, this is the opportunity. It's about green, just, and inclusive growth. And this is really where I think you mentioned about Hadi Soesastro and how he was always concerned about development. And this is really most of the time that I was at the bank, this was actually my battle. How do you integrate development, climate with development? Not just climate and development. It seems same, but it's not the same. But integrating climate with development and showing you, if you did this, then if you did the climate action, this is going to be what you're going to be benefiting from. And I like the way you mentioned the history of how we moved from Kyoto to Paris, agreeing on the unilateral NDCs, and then in Glasgow, a number of countries also committed to net zero, including developing countries, and I think that's the main point. And developing countries by then had, I guess, believed that the trade-off, it's not a trade-off, climate and development is not a trade-off, but they had another ask. They said, okay, I'm willing to be more ambitious in climate action, but where's the money? Where's the 100 billion you promised in Paris? And actually you need more than 100 billion, right? And this is the whole discussion now. And this is the development leg, the third leg that you mentioned about Hadi Soesastro, that we can't do it without the financing and the support that comes with having to achieve that ambition. So that's kind of my main message. I don't know whether I want to go through many of my slides because I'm probably running out of time. 7 more minutes, okay. So let me just show you this graph. This is again based on the World Bank simulations, which shows the first one is business as usual, second one is less ambitious climate action, and the last one is the more ambitious, and the orange is the CO2 coming down. The black is energy, and the green is food and land use and agriculture, right? So you can see right now, which is the beginning, food and land use and energy is contributing about the same to mitigation, but energy is going to really be the one that, if you don't do anything, is the one that's going to be the overwhelming portion of the emission, and that's why energy transition, and I would say energy transition and energy access in the remote areas is still going to be the key issue that we have to address in mitigation. And this is the simulation for Indonesia. This is the ambitious action, which is scenario 3. It's what you mentioned, higher carbon tax, as well as removing the subsidies and new land and energy policies. So this is what needs to happen. And the question is, what do we think should happen? Because removal of subsidies is always politically difficult, right? So I just want to say that for the first time, we've been observing this at CSIS with the polling and so on. Environment issues in the political surveys didn't come up at all. People didn't care about environment as a policy issue when they're looking at the candidates until recently. It started coming out, and especially for the young people. And I think that's the main reason why all 3 candidates had something to say about climate change. you can question whether they said was sensible or not, but at least it was mentioned compared to 5 years ago, okay? So there's a change. And I just wanted to mention, somebody sent me a UNDP survey done recently in 77 countries. And 86% of Indonesians polled said that they want the government to do something serious about climate. Because they are feeling the impact, right? So I think that's a good sign. And I'm going to spread that survey as much as possible, because hopefully a message for the next government. So I think we are seeing the tipping point, is that the right word for it? And the window for action to be taken, right? And really, this is in a nutshell, what you need to do. Policy reforms and having a country platform. I'm kind of trying to promote this notion of country-owned, country-led platform. Like, you mentioned it too. Countries have different conditions. So countries need to design what is their long-term low-carbon development strategy and underpin that with the policies. And the most important is the development part, the complementary measures to make sure that it's just and inclusive. Where do the resources come from? It has to come from the domestic resources. First of all, your fiscal, your budget, and so on, and financing for investment at scale. This is the ask. You want us to be ambitious? Where's the money? Okay, but of course, when the people giving money, they say, okay, here's the money, but what are you doing to achieve this ambition? And this is actually coming from our government. Masyita can speak to this. She's been very involved with this, has been trying to come up with a country platform, or whatever word you want to use, and identifying the investments that are needed in sustainable infrastructure, including energy. And this is the bill estimate, you know. It's 286 trillion, per year. And our budget only covers 80 trillion. And probably this is an underestimate of what we need. So you have to come up with, this is the investment needs, and this is the financing gap. And I already put in my budget, but I need help, right? So this is really where we are, what we are talking about in terms of the enablers and carbon pricing. Just one word on carbon pricing, because this is too long to explain. Just to tell you that there's a lot of people in this room, by the way, who are practitioners and who know very much about this. But the point here is that we have started. As you said, we are ahead of you, but we're just starting, and maybe baby steps. And there are lots of issues in there if we really want to cooperate on carbon pricing. Verification, the pricing, the content, and the fact that we don't allow cross-border trading, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the new government is hopefully going to be focusing on this. I heard they have a carbon task force that they have created. So that's good news, right? So a lot of input there that we need. I don't think I'll talk about this, but just to emphasize that what you mentioned, a lot of times when we talk about energy transition, we just focus on the coal exit. But really, the grid, you mentioned that, the clean up, and then the just and affordable transition, as well as the renewable energy. It needs to come together, and this is a simplified explanation of the Indonesian energy transition platform. You have differentiated investment needs, which means you need differentiated sources of funds. And this is where public funding, concessional funding, private funding needs to come together, and the policies that are important around it. Okay, I'm probably, well, how many minutes? 3 minutes? 1 minute? 1 minute? Okay, so I wanted to come to this last point, because you mentioned this, and I totally agree with you that, you know, ideally, if we could specialize and have our comparative advantage and there was no geopolitics, you would have low-cost carbon technologies, and it will be diffused, and developing countries could access it, and there wouldn't be so much of an issue. But because of geopolitics, because of IRA, because of critical minerals issue having to be diversified and deconcentrated, and the foreign entities of concern, i.e. China, this is leading you to defragmentation and not going to the lowest cost. And this is hurting us as developing countries, right? And so maybe as a discussant, you didn't mention China at all in your speech today, and we all know that you know a lot about China. So if you could, in your response to us, say how do we see China in this? Because every discussion I've been having, it's always there's the China factor. I just came from Brazil, where I was very surprised because I had not been to Latin America for a while. And there was a lot of private sector people there. And the Siemens guy said, what are we talking about? Trying to recreate, what is the US and Europe talking about? Trying to recreate the supply chains for this low carbon technology. China has everything, from end to end. How are you going to ever be able to compete with that and have it'll take time for you to do that, right? So, BYD is also just come into Brazil. So they were actually very enamored with China and Chinese investments, right? So I just wanted to see whether you can comment on the role of China. And my point here is about navigating the geopolitics. And my very short answer is that it has to be what you were saying about regional cooperation, bilateral and sub-regional cooperation, like what you were saying about Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste and Papua and Sumatra and Singapore exporting power. But it has to be done with the principle of open regionalism. So we cooperate, but it is done with the open regionalism principles. And we can come up with regional initiatives like EGS, which can be voluntary, but can be negotiated either in the regional context or in the multilateral context. Unfortunately, EGS hasn't quite made it yet into the WTO negotiations. We had been pushing for that. But I also think in the multilateral discussions, trade and climate and standards. Standard is becoming a big issue, especially with like CBAM and so on, which should be talked about in the multilateral world. And if it's not the WTO, where else would it be? So that would be my thing. And then bilateral initiatives in Australia and Indonesia. I know there's a lot being done here with Australia and Indonesia with your, it's actually in the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Partnership Agreement. There's a climate article in there for cooperation, and then you have kinetics that have come up. Australia has come forth with their development cooperation and support to look at the 3 pillars on the investment, the capacity building, and helping Indonesia with the country platform. So all in the right direction. And you were mentioning furthermore to do the, super grid and the carbon pricing. I think I'm not sure I will have time to say that. I just wanted to say something about RCEP. I do think the answer is not for Indonesia to have an FTA on critical minerals with the US in trying to overcome this IRA and all that. And anyway, it's probably never going to happen because the Congress doesn't want to do any trade agreements. I don't know whether IPEF, that's supposed to be IPEF, not IPF, whether IPEF is trying to be a little bit like APEC. It's voluntary and non-binding and all that. Whether the resilient supply chain pillar can actually help, because Australia, Indonesia are in there. I don't know the answer, but it's worth an effort. But I think it's more important to build on regional agreements and engage with both the US and the EU, because to critical minerals, mining, EV batteries, EV vehicles, you need scale to become competitive. So if it's the US market, it's the EU market, but it can also be our own market, our regional market. And this is my dilemma. Are we going to end up with 2 supply chains? One that reduces the entity of concern so that you can enter the US and you can enter the EU, and then where it doesn't matter with the region, where we can have our regional supply chain based on our critical minerals. Australia has lithium, we have nickel, we have the raw materials here. We can develop the supply chain for the low carbon technologies for our regional use, not just for our own national use. So I'm probably out of time already, so I'll probably end here, even though I had some comments on your super grid and so on, but maybe we can come back to that question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilmari. Ross did mention China in passing when he mentioned China-US rivalry. But we need more, Ross. Let me invite Ibu Mari introduce something like a very big Green New Deal. I wonder, how are we going to organize ourselves for the financing? I think if we are creative enough, we will make it. Reallocating resources from carbon-intensive industries in favor of decarbonized industries. Please, Ibu Masyita, time is yours, 15 minutes. Non-discrimination, 15 minutes.
Terima kasih Pak Djisman, thank you Pak Ross dan Ibu Mari. I'm very honored to be in the Hadi Soesastro Forum. He's also one of my first mentors. I was his photocopy girl back when I was a student here. Go back and forth when he has meetings. I will write notes for him, contacting this famous economist for him, and then have the opportunity to listen to big issues in Indonesia during that time. So I think I was lucky as a third-year student at UI to have worked with Pak Hadi Soesastro as my first job. And during this time, I was actually trained in macroeconomics and international trade. However, when I started working in the Ministry of Finance 5 years ago, Ibu Sri Mulyani asked me to also work on climate change, which is a very far thing that I want to do to begin with. When I was studying in the econ, I want to do monetary, I want to do international trade, international finance, and I did my PhD in international finance. I also remembered in 2010-9 when I was having a hard time doing my PhD, Pak Hadi sometimes would chat me just to make me survive the period. So it was really, your dad was a wonderful man, Agus, so it's really wonderful. Okay, so I want to review all of the stuff that Prof. Garnaut and also Ibu Mari have mentioned, but maybe I would like to share a little bit on the backdrop of how the Ministry of Finance and government overall is looking at the issues. We're thinking about, the big initiative, right, at the regional, global level, how to do it at the big policy level. But then at the national level, and in fact at the fiscal policy level, what can you do to actually catalyze private investment coming to Indonesia, right? So this is the chart that we started in the Ministry of Finance that, to make ourselves realize that the current policy, the NDC that we're mentioning, that we will all globally will start to do the new NDC next year, which next year makes it another important time for climate people. But then it's still actually far below the net zero target that we're supposed to do. And then how do we do the transition, right? We want to do an abrupt on the left hand, you just do business as usual and suddenly you ran out of your carbon budget and then you cannot do anything anymore. Or you do it a bit like in the number 2 where you can start to reduce emission gradually and nicely. This is the one that without a very big and important crisis. Or at the third option or fourth option, you actually have to have some removal where we currently don't have a good technology at an affordable rate to be able to do number 4, right? But then how, Pak Djisman asked, do we actually getting the finance? If we get creative, we should get the finance. Creativity is one thing, Pak Djisman, but what I learned is that the mechanism at the global level is also skewed towards not getting the climate finance that we need. The climate finance currently, it's debt heavy. So a majority of the financing is actually debt at the private level. So there's no concessional whatsoever. It's limited and only, and even more so for adaptation. The number is insufficient. Prof. Garnaut has already mentioned it. not concessional enough, I can give you another presentation on how the setup of JETP in Indonesia and the South Africa relationship and why we think it won't work. It's inefficient, like, you know, people mention that the World Bank or GCF is actually take a long time to get project on the ground from the first discussion until it goes on the ground. And also it's unfair, not only to mitigation, adaptation, the pricing. I just take you one chart on the bottom that in adaptation, the blue part is the market rate, right? And the grants is only the red part. So you can see adaptation get more grants, but the rest of it is actually a regular financing. Even in the Ministry of Finance, we have global sukuk. So we have green bonds, and we have no greenium or like a benefit from having, you know, to do green bonds compared to regular bonds in terms of the yield that we're getting. So the financing is there, the money is there, but it doesn't rightly being channeled into the climate finance because of this characteristic that we're facing. Prof. Garnaut already mentioned vulnerability and why, you know, emerging market or archipelagic like Indonesia is much more vulnerable to climate change, and, you know, why we need to be compensated more, at least to get part of the financing that we need. I'll skip this on the Indonesia global leadership. I'll go straight to what Indonesia do to get the financing, right? So one thing is to create a blended financing. Blended financing is a big term that we all use. Basically, we want to lower the cost of financing, so we need not only the market rate financing, but also the concessional. Indonesia started with SDG 1. The ticket size is still very small, but if you look at the project, you have a lot of projects. But as you can see, managing a lot of partners, they have like their own requirement on, you know, this green stuff and that. And sometimes just to do one project, you have to change a lot of things to be able to deal with different partners, including in JETP, it's also the same, that you end up with not doing anything or not getting enough concessional that you need. So whatever we talk about at the global level cannot translate into a project level implementation. On developing the right price for carbon, I won't say anything more on this. We're still developing it because of the COVID. We are waiting for the carbon tax implementation, and carbon market is another discussion for itself. So what else does the government do currently on trying to get in the financing we need to do the transition, right? Another big thing is on the energy transition mechanism. So for Indonesia and DC, between the FOLU, the forestry, and the energy, it's more or less 50-50 target. But the cost of the abatement cost for energy sector, it's much more higher. And Indonesia, Java, Bali has a 13 gigawatt overcapacity. And of course, if we assume economic growth at 8%, that overcapacity will die down. But then if the economic growth, as we can see from the previous presentations, being challenged at only around 5, then, you know, the oversupply is probably going to stay. We're thinking a mechanism where we can crowd in private investment into the projects, right? So we created, we call the country platform. I understand that country platform is a generic definition that's used very loosely, but in this particular thing is the country platform that the Indonesia government create for the energy transition mechanism, which include the coal phase out part, and also the clean energy part or the build-up of the renewable energy. So it is a mechanism where you can put it some of the private financing and the government and also the bilaterals and philanthropies into one blended financing and put it into the country platform that goes into project. So these things are still ongoing, but as I mentioned, you know, the complexity at the ground to actually getting the financing is not as simple as what we hope for. Especially some part will depend on also the global definition of transition finance that can get the financing. Okay, I have 5 more minutes ya Pak Djisman ya. 3 minutes? 4? Okay, 5 is okay. I get one 1 minute discount. So I'm gonna talk about another thing that goes beyond a country level, right? So this is the global definition of what can be financed. So now the world is moving into green financing, sustainability financing. So you have this verification, you have a certain definition of what can be financed under the name green. But a lot of the activity in the emerging market is actually not categorized as green activity. So you cannot get financing to get your net zero target or your NDC target. Your NDC target definitely can, but if you want to go further, going to my first chart, you cannot do it. So we need to build institution, and then we have transition taxonomy and domestic regulation. So Indonesia is working on this, Professor Garnaut. So we're thinking we want to develop a high quality and high integrity transition asset, not just green, but also include the transition with all of these characteristics. Maybe we can discuss more if needed. And then use this for our energy transition mechanism. During Indonesia chairmanship in ASEAN, we actually spearheaded the development of the ASEAN Transition Taxonomy version 2, which include this transition activity, including energy, industry, etc. Now Singapore also have revised. Indonesia taxonomy has also revised. But then without the acceptance of the global community or taxonomy from advanced economy, from Australia, from Europe, or from US, then it's a one-sided definition of transition, right? So I think part is creating an enabling policy environment in Indonesia. Second is creating the needed institutional mechanism, like a country platform, for example, because now we don't have a climate unit, right? Ibu Mari is the President Climate Special Envoy, but we don't have a ministry yet under the President. So sometimes creating the country platform, like I mentioned before, is important to make sure that all of the targets, can be operational. I think I'll stop there. So thank you, Prof. Garnaut, for the presentation. I enjoyed very much, and maybe a little bit more on the implementation and how you actually can make it operationalized in the discussion further could be helpful for Indonesia and Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Masyita. Rose, I suggest we collect questions first from the floor because of time constraints, and then you respond to the two discussions and to the floor later. Yeah? Thank you. Who is going to start the discussion? One here, that wing, not yet, and then one here. Yeah? Okay, please identify yourself in the interest of the audience, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for Professor Ross and Professor Mari and Dr. Masyita for very insightful the materials and also lectures. A little bit introduction. My provisional thesis topic is about electric vehicles. Is it good to ride electric vehicles? Because no sound, no emission, but if we think a little bit deeper, the source of electricity itself is coal, and we know that the coal is a big emitter of greenhouse gas emission. So if the adoption of electric vehicles become a national project, so how can we reduce the role of coal, but at the same time increase of electricity? And how could we finance it? Because the transition itself is quite costly and complex. Thank you.
Thank you. From this side, please.
Thank you. Don Greenlees from AsiaLink at the University of Melbourne. This question particularly is for Professor Garnaut, but for the whole panel. Most of the discussion today centred on regulatory frameworks, policy frameworks. I just have a particular interest in a couple of technologies, and I'd like to get your view on, is there a role for nuclear, and is there a role for carbon capture? I know a number of Indonesian analysts and officials are quite attracted to the idea of carbon capture. But are both of those technologies potentially blind alleys in this debate? Are they solutions or blind alleys?
Thank you. On this side, Pak, silakan. Yes.
Thank you, Prof. Garnaut. Thank you, Prof. Bu Mari and Bu Masyita. My name is Matt Rilzam. I'm Senior Advisor of Equity and also Regional Development of Bappenas. Well, I'm still Acting Director for Forestry and Water Conservation and former Director for Environment at Bappenas before. Well, I still remember when we developed our long-term scenario of development. And we include, of course, low carbon development scenario in our case. And we certainly include the net zero emission for 2060 at our targets. And I still remember during our policies scenario exercise, this can be achieved. The net zero emission target in 2060 can be achieved, but with a very strong and huge transformation process in our economic structure. And it is indeed require a lot of transitions in terms of energy, in terms of many things. So then it will quite costly to our economic in our short and medium terms developments. In that case, I would like to have your opinion on that. So then we can certainly figure out how then we can go past through this transition era. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak. For the first round, let me give the floor first to Ross. You want to respond first? You, and then Masyita, and then Ibu Mari. Please, Ross.
First, on Mari's comment about the omission of China. As you said, Dr Djisman, I did not neglect it entirely. I mentioned it as part of the geostrategic rivalry which is leading to fragmentation of the world trading system, which is so damaging to development and to climate change. I did say that given the current state of geostrategic thinking in the US, China, and elsewhere in the world, some fragmentation is inevitable. But what we have to do is try to avoid the breaking of the back of global development and the breaking of the back of action on climate change as we live with that inevitable fragmentation. I was a little bit encouraged by one thing that the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said in a speech in Washington about a year ago. I think it was a speech at Brookings. He said what we need is a small yard and a high fence around the genuine security issues. If you put a hopeful interpretation on that, it says there are a certain limited number of genuine strategic issues in which countries need to, for reasons of security, to restrict international trade and investment, but they are not so large. It's a small yard, and we can put a high fence around those and allow open trade in the rest. The problem is that in practice, we've tended to put have quite a big yard. Increasingly, it looks like an America-wide yard, and not a small fence, but a great wall of America. And that is a mistake. That's a mistake for American development. It's very damaging to global development. There is a danger of the world trading system developing into two blocks. As Mari said, it could be a block of the US and Europe on one hand, and Asia and the developing world on the other. with China and Indonesia and a lot of developing countries not being part of the US-European system. We know from the pure theory of international trade that you absorbed very well a long time ago that restrictions on trade damage all countries, but they damage mostly smaller countries. Self-sufficiency in the US could be achieved at a considerable cost, but maybe for them a manageable cost, a high cost, but maybe they could live with it. But small countries can't achieve development without a deep integration into the international economy. We've proved that time and time again. But if the world breaks it down not into a lot of little blocks, but two big ones, the rest of the world these days is a bit bigger than US plus Europe. And so everyone loses enormously by the breakdown of the world into two blocks. But the biggest losers will be the smaller block. If that's the way it happens, as you described, and the smaller block is the US and Europe. And that would be very damaging, first because I think it'd be very damaging, first because I care about what happens in development and success in the US and Europe, but also the most advanced large countries doing well can be very favorable for global development if it's allowed to be. So how do we make get back to Jake Sullivan's idea of a small yard and a high fence? Well, it does require some rigor in identifying what are genuine strategic interests. You can make anything seem a strategic interest and a reason for restriction on trade if you put your mind to it. Making boots can become strategic if you say, well, our army's going to need boots to march. And so we have to be analytic about it. We have to recognize the very high cost of restrictions on trade and fragmentation of the trading system, and only restrict that trade for security reasons if there are very good security reasons for doing it. My own view is that there are some, but limited ranges of restrictions on trade that are genuinely security interests, and there's a subset of those that are security interests that are worth the economic cost. And one should bear in mind that the most fundamental determinant of real security, even in military terms in the long term, is economic performance. It's big countries that win long wars with very few exceptions. Big economies that ring long wars. So how should we deal with it in practice? First, we've got to apply some real economics and get rid of some nonsense in the discussion. I've seen discussion in some of the business press in the US and recently in Europe about China having a comparative advantage in everything. They'll take over everything if we have open trade. Well, we know from that same pure theory of international economics that you can't have a comparative advantage in everything. China becoming a very big exporter of some products, it becomes a very big importer of other products. Australia and Indonesia have been big beneficiaries of that over the last 2 decades. So let's get the basic economics right. Temporarily, China is running an increasing trade surplus at the moment. That's not sensible for China and needs to be corrected for their own reasons. But that's a small part of the total story. We need to recognize that China's strength in the zero carbon goods is to a considerable extent because the Chinese government recognized early that that's the way the world was going. My report on my climate change review, when it was published in 2008, the China academic press asked for permission to publish it in Chinese. It was published with the support of the National Development Reform Commission. When I visited the Vice Chairman of the National Development Reform Commission in China, he had on his desk a copy of the Chinese translation of my report. And in that conversation, he said, this is the way the world's going. We see some advantages for China for investing heavily in the industries that are going to be important in the future. He said, we won't be able to jump over Nagoya and Detroit in making cars. They've been doing it on the old ways for 100 years. But if cars have to be made in a new way, well, we can be at the forefront of that. So we'll start investing in electric vehicles because that's got to be the future. Now, we can't actually blame anyone but ourselves if they've done very well by taking seriously the things we all should have been taking seriously. Similarly, China's become by far the world's main producer of solar panels. On some calculations, about 90% of the world's solar panels. A very high proportion of wind turbines, a smaller proportion, a very high proportion of nuclear reactors, a very high proportion of hydroelectric goods. That's a lot, but that's not a comparative advantage in anything. But secondly, if we have an open trading system, China doesn't have a comparative advantage in all those things. The silicon, which is the essential input into solar panels, is energy intensive. It needs zero carbon inputs. Certainly Australia, probably Indonesia has more advantages in some of those things than China has. And on legitimate economic grounds, the world, if it specialized according to comparative advantage, would not be reliant on China as a supplier of silicon. And so there's a whole lot of industries where we'd get greater diversification just by making sure we did the things that we had comparative advantage in. And so their ways of reducing reliance on China that have an economic benefit and not an economic cost. So what I'd suggest is that we recognize there are some areas of trade and investment with our genuine strategic interests. We be very analytic in approaching those. And I'm pleased to say that the Australian government is starting to be more analytic after a period when we weren't, with the Treasury being very closely involved with the security agencies recently in defining what's an appropriate restriction on investment. And having open trade wherever there's not a very strong strategic interest. Now, the situation of countries which are not aligned strategically with either China or Australia is different. So there's an opportunity maybe for those countries, including Indonesia, to be more flexible. In a world that does break down into two blocks, there's an enormous advantage for the whole world, including members of those two blocks, in some important countries trading with both. In the ancient world, China valued silver much more highly relative to gold than Europe did. And so when Magellan rounded the Cape of Good Hope and Colombo crossed the Atlantic, and later other Spanish and Portuguese sailors traveled across the Pacific, everyone thought, every visitor from Europe to China thought that it was truly wonderful because gold was very cheap compared with silver, and China thought it was wonderful because silver was very cheap compared with gold in the other place. And so you had a marvelous arbitrage, which made Acapulco a great trading center as the gold moved from Mexico to China, and the silver moved to China and the gold moved back. Well, countries in the middle, and Spain was in the middle of that for a while, can do very well from the arbitrage of trading from both, and that's a very good place for Indonesia, and I would hope Australia to be in. Long time on that, but that was a big question, Mary. Briefly on others, Ibu Masyita, very thoughtful and important comments on financing. I just reinforce points that have already been made. This is not going to, the climate transition not going to work for the world unless the developed countries do what they promised. That's the 100 billion, and it's going to be more in the end. Fortunately, Australia, after a period of not being very serious about this, is getting on board that, and I think we can look forward to our share. And some of the things that we should be doing in Australia and Indonesia, I hope, will be supported by official finance. The US under President Biden has gone further, tried to go further than they've been allowed to by the Congress. Europe is in a better space, but hasn't done enough. But we have to make sure the developed world does what it promised on support there. The question on are EVs good if the electricity comes from coal? 2 points there. 3 points. First, EVs, electric engines, are much more efficient than internal combustion engines. They use less energy per kilometre. So you get a gain from lower energy use, even if the energy comes from a polluting source. Second point, as Ibu Masyita said, Indonesia is restricting investment in coal, and so the grid's going to be more and more low emissions over time. And so the movement to electric vehicles, the movement to lower emissions electricity can go hand in hand. And if we waited for the grid to be low emissions before we started investing in electric vehicles, then we'd have lost an opportunity. So the two things should go hand in hand. And the third point, internal combustion engines do a lot of damage other than the climate damage, and it'll be very good for the longevity, the health, and enjoyment of life of people in Jakarta if you get rid of a fair bit of that air pollution. The question about do nuclear and CCS have a role? Nuclear is a genuinely zero emissions source of power. It is very expensive. And when I did my climate change review in 2008, the calculations then of the costs of various technologies said that nuclear would have some role in Australia in the 2030s. That was based on an assumption that renewable energy would come down in cost by a few % per annum, and nuclear would come down a little bit, but at a lower rate. Well, what's happened since then? Nuclear energy costs have increased a lot, and renewable energy has fallen in cost at many times the rate at which was anticipated. So in a country with good renewable energy resources and plenty of land to use it, nuclear is simply uncompetitive with renewable energy plus storage. There will be some countries, densely populated countries with poor renewable energy resources, that need to use other sources of power. That's most importantly Northeast Asia and Europe. Nuclear will although it will be very expensive, is an economically rational part of the mix there. Countries that use it will not be competitive in exporting anything that uses a lot of energy. So that's a very important basic matter. CCS is very expensive. We know it works technically, a wonderful project at the University of Melbourne has tested this, and in the Otways in southwest Victoria. It works fine, but it's very expensive. It's not complete. There's always some emissions, but it can get down emissions a lot. I would see it as having a legitimate role in the mix if it can compete on commercial and economic terms once you have a carbon price. Of course, there's no role for nuclear or CCS without a carbon price, but we should have a carbon price. With a carbon price
in the very best locations, good geological structures, not very far from very pure streams of carbon dioxide. It will be economic at the sort of carbon price we're looking at, the European carbon price, but that's going to be a limited role, not a big role. Finally, Pak Matrosa, on net zero 2060 is being achievable, but involving a structural change, which while it might lead to economic benefits in the long term, costs a lot in the short term and has to be financed. I agree. And the developed countries, including Australia, have to step up to what they've promised.
Thank you. So I will not add much to that, but just we are in a transition year between the current government and the new government, right? In the government mind, we of course would like to have a higher growth, lower inequality, we achieve our net zero target, etc. We have a lot of target with very limited policy options and also fiscal capacity. So what I would like to offer you is that, you know, when Ibu Mari said, okay, previously it was climate versus development, no longer there. Climate and development, we shouldn't be there either. But how do we actually embed climate into the regular development? So the right question is, can we use green growth strategy to help the government around the world to recover from the current slump? And for the government of Indonesia and Australia, Indonesia is trying to be an advanced economy by 2045. It means we have to grow above 7%. What type of green growth strategy that can be embedded into the development strategy that can help the government achieve that? So we're working on a report, working on the green industrialization, energy transition, the sustainable finance and transition finance development, and also food security, as well as sustainable agriculture, four of that channel into, you know, helping how each of the channel can crowd in investment, and then also creating growth for Indonesia. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add, and not to be too long in giving you the answer, I think just on Don's question on nuclear and CCS, CCS, sometimes you say CCUS, I always get confused. I think it has to be part of the tools that we use in the sense that it's going to take a long time to have the coal phase out. Can be 20 years, 30 years. So in the meanwhile, you're still going to have coal being part of your energy supply. So just like what happened in the oil shock, you know, I think two things need to happen in parallel to reducing coal. One is the energy efficiency itself, and then second, you know, can you still use coal but use it in a cleaner way? Whatever that means in the technology sense. And I think technology will, maybe it's not commercial now, maybe it's not economical as you were saying now, but maybe it will eventually become that. And that is the answer is technology. And Indonesia just passed, what did we just pass? We just passed the regulations, right, on CCS and CCUS. And on nuclear, at the moment, our renewable energy law is still in draft, right? Or in parliament, I don't know where it is. Hasn't been passed anyway. And I'm not quite sure whether, because right now you can't do nuclear because it's not allowed, right? So they're trying to introduce it in the new draft of the renewable energy, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't quite know where that law is at the moment, but that is going to be an important component. And yes, it's going to be still expensive, but I heard that they're coming up with smaller nuclear reactors now. Yeah, so in the US, in China.
Smaller and new and more expensive.
And more expensive, okay. But it still can be part of the review. Just on financing, two more points, because this is kind of in the big messaging. Green growth story is I think the way to try to get the narrative and the politicians and the policymakers to come on board. It is about jobs, but most importantly, it's about investment. right? It's an investment story. And if you get your elements right, you can attract investment because the financing has to come from private sector investment coming in and financial sector coming in to invest in it. So it's an investment story, and it's investing in new growth areas, just like what you were saying earlier. It's the opportunity. You know, you were saying China invested in the future opportunities, and now they're 20 years ahead of everybody, right? So I think investment story is the investment story. And finally, on financing, the private sector component is actually the biggest part of it. It's not the 100 billion. 100 billion needs to catalyze, I don't know, 1 trillion, something like that, right? And that's really what we are all trying to talk about in this blended finance structures. How do you blend it so that you can reduce the risk and reduce the costs? A final number for you to reflect why this is such a challenge. The most recent IEA report on investment showed that now the investment in renewable energy, you know, really went up exponentially, and it's more than what investments in fossil fuel. But guess where it's going? China and the US, like 80 or 90% is going to China and the US. Africa is only getting 1.6%, and the rest of emerging countries is like getting 8 or 9%. Why? Perceived risk, high risk, as well as a higher cost. Yeah? The cost of doing renewable energy in emerging markets is about double than that of doing it in China or in the US. So these things have to be addressed.
Thank you, Bu Mari. Because of time, we will have to come to the end of this policy forum. This is now 12:15. But I hope that participants in this room have already collected very important lessons to bring home. The issues we discussed are very complex, and there is no simple answer to that. And Ross was mentioning Hadi Soesastro as a source of wise thinking. Science alone will not help us. Logic alone will not help us. It will have to be wise. But to have wise thinking integrated into policy making, I think we also have to educate our leaders. Hopefully, the name you mentioned will not win in the other side of the Pacific, because otherwise it will be very difficult for us to get forward, to move forward. Thank you very much, Ross Garnaut. A single Noah Ark is not going to save us. Everybody has to build their own respective boats, contributing to the solution. Otherwise, we will be up for what is called anthropogenic extinction, the sixth extinction. And I hope we are wise enough to do the things needed to avoid that. With this, I would like to thank you again, Ross Garnaut, for your lecture, for renewing friendship with us here at CSIS and for Indonesia. I thank Ibu Mari also and Ibu Masyita for the very insightful discussion. I hope that CSIS will provide all the materials in the website that people can access to. With this, I would like to conclude the lecture, and I hope to see you again in another round of Hadi Soesastro Policy Forum in the future. Thank you very much.
Once again, on behalf of all the organizers, I would like to extend our greatest gratitude for your time and also the fruitful discussion for Professor Ross Garnaut, Professor Mari Pangestu, Dr. Masyita Crystallin, and Professor Djisman Simandjuntak. I would like to ask for you to please remain on stage for a photo session by the documentation team and also media partners. And I would also like to invite Bapak Agus Soesastro to come on stage to join the photo session. Please, Pak.
I'm sorry. On Monday, we also plan a big event here at CSIS. We will be having JAPSEX and
We're having the Decarbonization Lab launch of the Trade and Investment and Climate Report, the first one. And we will then also have Jeff Sachs as a keynote speaker after that. So please come back.
Let's come back on the 1st of July for the Decarbonization for Development Lab report launch. We will post the information on screen, but now let's move on to the photo session first. Please, may I ask all of the panels and moderators to stand up, and Pak Agus Soesastro, please join us on stage. Pak Budi, we would also like to ask you to join us on stage for the photo session, and Pak Yose as well. Thank you so much. A round of applause for our session today. Thank you so much for the fruitful discussion.